on the Afghanistan strategy to communicate those war.
Well, the first thing the president did was, first of all, let me say I appreciate the compliment about, but it was easier to sell the country on Barack Obama than it was to sell them on wars that had been going on for years and for which there was no end in sight. So that is a different and more challenging assignment. The first thing that the president did when he decided to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan was to go to West Point and make a speech about it. So, and he made a very eloquent case for why he was doing what he was doing. But you can't go out and sell a policy before you have a policy, mm-hmm. and that was our challenge.
So maybe there was a little bit of misunderstanding between the Pentagon and the White House.
Maybe, but look, again, they have a job and they have a perspective, and they're focused on their job and perspective. At the same time that all of this was going on, we also had to sell the country on a recovery plan for the economy. We were involved in healthcare. There is a kind of limit to presidential communications and how many things you can communicate at what time and so on. So he was dealing with a whole portfolio of difficult issues that he needed to communicate, not just the one that they were singularly focused on, mm-hmm. as critical as it was. And look, there's nothing more serious than war and the commitment of young people to it. But so, my answer is they were thinking about this from their perspective, and as they should have been. The president was thinking about it from a broader perspective, as he should have been.
So, shifting gears a little bit and talking just more broadly about your role as a political advisor. So in 2017, after the National Security Council was reorganized under the Trump administration, Steve Bannon, a political advisor, was placed on that council. In some ways, people might liken him to a similar position as you. How do you feel that your participation in NSC...
Only in our sartorial splendor.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel that your participation in those National Security Council meetings was used as a precedent or justification for placing Bannon?
Well, I would challenge the premise of your question, because participation suggests that I was engaged in the conversation. Mm-hmm. My role was simply to be an observer. And that was made clear to everyone from the beginning. I was not a member of the National Security Council. I would not have accepted such an appointment because I wasn't qualified to be that. I was there because I wanted to hear the conversation and make sure that when it came time to communicate the president's decisions, that I was fully informed about them. And so I think that was the analogy failed. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, Steve Bannon was not a member of the National Security Council. I think he's over in Europe trying to get on security councils over there now.
So going back to that point, though, even when we accept that you didn't have direct input or participation in the National Security Council deliberations, but part of it also as an optics issue, as Secretary Gates wrote about in his book, he said, "I felt this major national security debate had been driven more by the White House staff and by domestic politics than any other in my entire experience." He mentions you. He says, "I thought Obama did the right things on national security, but everything came across as politically calculated." Is there anything you would have done differently with regard to the optics or whatever gave him and the military leadership that impression?
I'm going to keep repeating myself. I understand the perspective that he had. Let me just say one thing. I said earlier that...
And this is Secretary Gates, who worked for 40 years under many different presidential administrations.
No, I understand. Look, as I said, I just sat with him. I have enormous respect for him. That doesn't mean he's immune to the same kind of parochiality that anybody else in government is subject to. I don't... one of our concerns, honestly, and they were borne out in this process, was that there would be selective leaks out of this process, and that we would not be in a position as people who were out there talking to understand the full context of these conversations. And maybe it's possible that the folks from the defense side felt more comfortable if there weren't people there who were fully privy to the conversations. All I can say is, when it came to the decision-making process, I did not know. I know in his book, Bob Gates wrote that Jim Jones told him that I was telling people the president would never accept the military's recommendations. That is just completely false, because I didn't know until the very last what the president's decision would be. And I was not part of the decision-making process in these wars. So if Secretary Gates had that impression, I'm sorry that he did, but as I told him when I saw him, that was not the case.
So you're saying there is an appropriate role for political advisors at the end of that process, but not during it, not as...
Well, you can't have it both ways and say, right, gee, they have to do a better job of selling the war,
yeah,
and then say to the guys whose job it is to do that, but don't you be involved in the process. I mean, it's one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You got to get on your horse and ride it there.
So sitting in the Situation Room, you're taking in this information, but not helping out with the military decision-making.
Mm-hmm.
You came in with no military background. How did you close that expertise gap on national security?
That is first of all, I wouldn't call myself an expert on national security, just to be clear. But, one of the challenges for anybody in the White House, including the president, is that every single day you're confronted. I didn't know anything about deep sea oil leaks, and now I know more about them than I ever thought I would. I didn't know anything about pirates, until we faced that situation in Somalia. One of the great and stimulating things about working in the White House is that every single day you're confronting things that you didn't necessarily have a background in before. You have to be a generalist to work in the kind of job I worked. But the great thing about working in the White House is that you also have access to the foremost experts in the world on every single subject. And if you're smart about how you go about your work, you approach every topic with humility and take advantage of all of the resources that are available to get yourself up to speed.
What would you say was the best thing about working as a political advisor?
The God's honest truth is I did 150 campaigns, and I left after the last Obama campaign because that experience, from the time I started working with Senator Obama when he was a state senator here running for the Senate, through the 2012 campaign, it was politics as I thought politics should be. It was idealistic. It was driven by what is possible and a conviction that change, that through our process of democracy, you can actually change the course of history, change public policy for the better, help people and communities, and so my ride with him and the reaffirmation of idealism was very, very important to me. The second one, and I say this not to be patronizing, but every single day during those years and in other campaigns, I got to work with young people, and I saw really bright, well-motivated people who were skeptical but not cynical, and who understood their role in a democracy and were willing to take action. I was really inspired by that. It's one of the reasons why I started the Institute of Politics. I knew I was done with campaigns. I wasn't done with young people. And I go home optimistic every day because of that exposure. So I guess at the end of the day, that may be the best part of it.
Well, David Axelrod, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your experience and insights.
Thank you for having me, and thank you guys for what you're doing.
Thank you. We have some time for some audience questions, about 20 or so minutes. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, that would be a great time.
I've talked them into submission.
Yeah. Well, while we're getting ready for that, one more thing on one other military issue that played out during this time period was the don't ask, don't tell.
Yes.
Talk to us about why that was an important issue for President Obama.
Well, it was a solid, ironclad commitment. He felt strongly that people who wanted to serve our country should not be excluded on that basis. And it was one of the early meetings we had, another meeting in which I was an observer. But Secretary Gates came over with Admiral Mullen, General Cartwright, and the president said, I didn't invite you here to ask you whether we should end this policy. I invited you to say we are going to end it, but I want to do it in the most responsible way. And there was a very frank discussion. There were concerns on the part of Secretary Gates, of Admiral Mullen, about upheaval in the force at a time when we had two wars going, and the president was very sensitive to that. There was agreement that this should be done not by the act of the executive, but by Congress. It was instituted by Congress. And, it was a 2-year effort and done very, I think, responsibly. One of the things that happened was, we did research among the force, among active military. And what was what we found was that the generals and admirals were a lot more concerned about this than the service people. Rank and file were. And this just reflected the debate in our own society. I mean, young people were far less worried or concerned. And I think that gave some assurance to the leadership in the Pentagon that this is something that could happen. And then, you and I have talked about one of the most moving days I had when I was working for the president was the day that he signed the bill repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Mm-hmm. I think it was at the auditorium at the Commerce Department. And Admiral Mullen, who started off, I think, wary of the change, ended up being an extraordinary spokesperson for it and testified before Congress and said, I can't ask people who swear an oath to live a lie. And he gave very moving testimony. And when he walked into that room, and the gay community was well represented in that room along with others, when he walked into that auditorium, there was this massive ovation, and that was moving to me to see that to be there for that moment. So that was a big deal, and we see echoes of this debate today about transgender service members, but I'm just happy that people are stepping up and want to serve.
Why do you think Admiral Mullen's testimony was so effective, and why he was perceived so well?
Because I think Admiral Mullen I think that those who had a concern about whether this would be a disruptive were reassured by his testimony, but he put it on a fundamental level of values. Mm-hmm. And the desire to make sure that we weren't in fact encouraging members of the military to lie in order to serve. There was something fundamentally wrong to lie about who they were. And I think that he was so impassioned about that point that it was, I think, a watershed event in the debate.
We'll take a question.
Hi, my name is Ari. I'm a master's student in international relations here. I'm curious about the national security transition. Presidents often campaign one way, but then are constrained in office. President Bush said no more nation building, took us into Iraq. President Obama was an anti-war candidate, but kept a lot of the global war on terror architecture, whether it's drone strikes or rendition. And I guess I'm curious about what changed. Was it access to new information, or was it just constraint by Congress? Or
let me just challenge you a little bit on this, because if you go back and look at the campaign, President Obama was deeply critical of the decision to go into Iraq, but recognized that we needed to that we were there and needed to get out in an orderly fashion. President Bush had signed a status of forces agreement with the Iraqis, and President Obama implemented it. And he had campaigned on a timetable to remove the troops. That timetable shifted a bit on the recommendation of Secretary Gates, but not all that much. And as far as Afghanistan goes, he was very, very clear as a candidate that he thought that we were going to have to send more troops to Afghanistan.